this lecture, you are going to learn about mercantilism, the silver mines of the Spanish colonies, repartimiento, the base of royalties, and the Columbian exchange. After completing this lecture, the following historical questions will be answered. What were the economic foundations of Spanish colonial empire in the Americas? What were the effects of the Columbian exchange? And what were the governmental structure in the Spanish colonies? The Spanish will become a very wealthy empire thanks to their colonies in the Americas. The moment conquistadors arrive at the Americas, their mission to conquer for God and crown will inherently lead to colonization. So one can argue Spanish colonization began almost simultaneously with the discovery of the Americas. Aside from its religious purposes, conquest and colonization will also be driven by the theory of mercantilism. Mercantilists believe the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes that wealth is power and power is wealth. Mercantilism presumed that the world's wealth was fixed and that one country's wealth came at another's expense. So it was imperative for the Spanish to control and accumulate as much wealth as possible. The colonies will be used to generate wealth for the motherland. To assure that the motherland will be the pure beneficiary from the wealth found in the Americas, the colonies were forbidden to trade with the motherland's competitors. Spain acted upon the as yet undefined mercantile theory when in 1565 it perfected the fleet or flota system by which all legal trade with its American colonies was restricted to the annual fleets between Seville and designated ports on the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean. The outgoing ships bore manufactured articles. Returning their cargoes consisted partly of gold and silver bars. Silver was an important discovery for Spanish conquerors in Mesoamerica and the Andes. Initial precious metal exports from both Peru and New Spain were supplied through Spanish extraction of Native American mineral wealth. Between 1560 and 1685, Spanish America sent 25,000 to 35,000 tons of silver annually to Spain. Between the start of Pizarro's military expedition in 1531 and 1536, the original conquistadors sent enormous quantities of gold and silver to Europe and became the equivalent of contemporary multi-millionaires. But soon the Spanish will have their own silver mines in the region. Potosí, in present-day Bolivia, and Zacatecas, northern Mexico, were the two major silver motherlodes. The silver discovered in these areas will enable Spain to enter established trade networks in Asia. Now, all of southern Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean became part of a supply network for the northern and southern mines. This system pumped so much silver into European commercial networks that it transformed Europe's relationship to all its trading partners, especially those in China and India. The Spanish now had something the Asian markets wanted: silver. The silver found in the Americas will make the Spanish Empire very wealthy indeed. And by the 1500s, El Quinto Real, or the Royal Fifth, a 20% tax on mining production, was implemented and was the prime source of revenue for the Spanish state. European conquerors took more precious metals from Mexico and the Andes in 20 years than all the gold accumulated in Europe over centuries. This astonishing wealth did not only benefited the crown in Spain, but it also created local aristocracies. This wealth, however, depended heavily on slave and coerced indigenous labor. In 1549, the Spanish monarchy imposed the repartimiento system. The repartimiento system was also frequently called the mita in Peru and the cuatequil in New Spain. Repartimiento was a form of forced labor adopted and significantly intensified from the Inca and Mexica practices of requiring labor from subjugated villages. Legally, the work period was not to exceed 2 weeks, 5 in the mines, 3 or 4 times annually, and wages were to be paid. Those requirements, however, were ignored. Repartimiento was particularly brutal in the silver mines. In some villages, each year, under the repartimiento, village elders selected a stipulated number of men to toil in the shafts, refineries, and smelters. Under the Spanish, the diggings, hauling, and smelting taxed human limits to their capacity and beyond. Mortality rates were appalling. Brutal hard work and poisonous exposure to mercury, which was used in the refining process, led to the deaths of thousands. Slavery was also a part of the Spanish colonial economy. Where mineral wealth and surplus agricultural production was absent, enslaving the natives proved more attractive to Spaniards who wanted to make a quick profit. Nicaragua's principal economic activity in the 1530s was enslavement, who were then sent to Panama and Peru. There's no agreement on how many people were enslaved and sent out of Central America. Estimates range from 50,000 to hundreds of thousands. Aside from selling and enslaving native people, the Spanish will also participate in the transatlantic slave trade and bring slaves from Africa into their colonies. By the beginning of the 16th century, the toll of colonization significantly reduced the indigenous population of Spanish America. To meet the mounting demand for labor in mining and agriculture, the Spanish began to exploit a new labor force, slaves from Western Africa. Thus, it would not be uncommon to see African slaves working alongside indigenous slaves and workers under the horrible conditions of the mines and agricultural sectors of the Spanish colonial empire. Although precious minerals were perhaps one of the most coveted exports from the Americas to Europe, the collision of the two worlds will create a transfer of previously unknown plants, animals, people, products, diseases, and ideas between the Americas and Europe. This transfer is called the Columbian Exchange, named after Christopher Columbus. The Columbian Exchange transformed the environments, economies, and diets of both the people in the Americas and Europe. We will see a new form of agricultural exchanges of farming techniques and products. From the Americas, Europeans will take back corn, tomatoes, beans, cacao, peanuts, tobacco, and squash to Europe. Imagine how different a pizza will be without tomatoes. Well, it is all thanks to the Columbian Exchange. From Europe came domesticated animals like cattle, swine, and horses. Europeans also brought over their farming techniques and undermined habitats of indigenous mammals and birds. When they chopped down forests for sugar plantations. So to no surprise that before long plants and animals took on an increasingly European appearance in the Americas. Perhaps one of the most devastating aspects of the Columbian Exchange was the introduction of European diseases like smallpox, measles, the plague, and influenza to the Americas. The native populations did not have immunity to these diseases, and it disseminated up to 90% of the Amerindian population. Moreover, while the indigenous population continued to decline under Spanish rule, Spanish land claims continued to grow in the Americas. The growth of the Spanish claims in the Americas led to the creation of governmental territories. These new Spanish territories officially became known as viceroyalties. The viceroyalty lands were ruled by viceroys who were second to and in stand-in for the Spanish king. Viceroys were sent from Spain to rule on the king's name. Each had a high court and an archbishop. Within the viceroyalty's territory, the viceroys of New Spain aided in converting and coercing the native population to Christianity, developed an array of educational institutions, and oversaw the economy. Less than a decade after the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés and his men and indigenous allies defeated the Mexica at their capital city of Tenochtitlan, the first viceroyalty of New Spain was officially created. The viceroyalty of New Spain was the first of the 4 viceroyalties that Spain created to govern its conquered lands in the Americas. The viceroyalty of New Spain initially included all land north of the Isthmus of Panama under Spanish control. This later came to include Upper and Lower California, the area that is now the central and southwestern portion of the United States, and territory eastward along the Gulf of Mexico to Florida. The Viceroyalty of New Spain was also charged with governing Spain's Caribbean possessions. Later, in 1565, the newly conquered Philippines were placed under the jurisdiction of New Spain. The second of the 4 viceroyalties that Spain created to govern its domains in the Americas was the Viceroyalty of Peru. The Viceroyalty of Peru initially included much of South America under Spanish control, except for the coast of what is now Venezuela. The capital of the Viceroyalty of Peru was in Lima. The third Viceroyalty will be the Viceroyalty of New Granada. The Viceroyalty was created to support gold mining in the area. The last Viceroyalty was the Viceroyalty of Rio de Plata, in what is now modern-day Argentina. It was created to stop untaxed exports of silver through the region. Aside from the established viceroyalties, the Spanish domains in the Americas will also include what we call the fringe. Fringes lay outside of the economic centers of the colonies. They were more sparsely populated, and there was less economic stratification and more subsistence living. In the fringes, people at the bottom of the hierarchy became more important. And mixed-race people gained greater respect. Native and African life dominated life in the countryside in the fringes. The development of new overseas European colonies began a transformation in world history. The accidental discovery of the Americas led to conquest and great wealth for Europeans. The Spanish created colonies to enrich themselves and their monarchs. Indigenous labor was used to build the Spanish overseas empire and wealth. However, conquest, colonization, and diseases took a heavy toll on the indigenous population. As native populations were disseminated, lack of labor force from the Amerindians led to large-scale introduction of African slave laborers. As we move along, you will continue to learn about the consequences of colonization and Spanish colonial life. That is all for now. Please stay tuned for the next video lecture.